Good evening, everybody. You see one relieved guy up here. As I mentioned to several people, I was sort of panicking about the weather, and the weather collaborated today. So thanks for coming out on a February evening. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Werner Steger, and I'm a professor of history, and I currently hold the Greenspan Trust-Handel Foundation Endowed Chair in Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at DCC. And it's a privilege, my privilege, to welcome all of you to tonight's event. The Greenspan Trust and Handel Family Foundation have endowed this chair in 2006 to raise awareness about the genocides of the 20th century and the Holocaust in particular. And this obviously deserves, our gratitude. The Greenspan Trust and the Handel Family Foundation have supported the educational mission of Dutchess Community College over several decades now, and they contributed immeasurably to the cultural and intellectual life in our community. It is their generosity that has made it possible to bring outstanding scholars like Dr. Wendy Lower tonight to DCC. Regrettably, Shirley Handel sent her regrets, and she can't be with us tonight. And as most of you know, Bern Handel passed away recently, and this is sorely missed. But his legacy lives on through events like these. The Handel family is represented by their son, Stephen, tonight. Stephen, please give him a hand of applause. He's right here. So thank you, Handel family, for your generous contributions to enrich the educational life here at DCC. Also, our college president, Dr. Peter Jordan, sends his regrets. He's sort of under the weather, so he couldn't come out tonight. But I usually thank him at occasions like this for supporting these kinds of events. And I also want to give a shout out to the June and Aaron Gillespie Forum, who also have supported tonight's event with a generous contribution. Lastly, my appreciation goes to the staff of the DCC Foundation that has organized the logistics of this event, particularly its executive director, Diana Pollard. I want to make a quick plug for the DCC Foundation. It's an indispensable part of Dutchess Community College that does not only administer endowments like these, but provides hundreds of thousands of dollars in scholarships for our students every year. So if you appreciate what you see tonight and you don't know what to do with your money, that's where it should go. Okay. Finally, a note regarding the logistics of this event. Dr. Lower's lecture will be followed by a brief Q&A, as well as a book signing right outside the auditorium. Okay. Also at this time, I would like to ask you to please silence or turn off your cell phones. It is my pleasure now to introduce our guest speaker, another prolific and extraordinarily productive historian we were able to bring to campus. Dr. Wendy Lower is the John K. Roth Professor of History and the Director of the Mgrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. She is also the co-founder of the National Consortium of Directors of Human Rights, Holocaust and Genocide Centers, and is currently still, I believe, serving on the Babi Yar Holocaust Memorial Commission. Dr. Lower is the author and editor of numerous books, including Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, published in 2013, which was translated to 23 languages and was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her latest book, The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed, published in 2021, has been translated to several languages and won the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category in 2021. Her work was discussed in several influential media outlets, such as the New York Times, National Public Radio, CBS, and C-SPAN, to name just a few. The Ravine is a book unlike any other on the Shoah, at least any other I have read. Using a single photograph as her point of departure, Dr. Lower moves past the abstraction of numbers and investigates one incident of a mass shooting of what historians now refer to as the Holocaust by bullets in a small Ukrainian community. She shows us that the Holocaust in these small communities was often a personal, intimate, and collaborative affair. As a reviewer in the New York Times pointed out, quote, Lower shows us that it takes a lot of people to kill a lot of people, okay, end of quote. But the reader also learns, and that's unusual too in books like these, how a historian of her caliber works, right? The doggedness, the meticulousness, and the compassion for justice that drives her research in 6 different countries, all leading back to Mariupol, Ukraine. Some of what she finds will stun the reader in unexpected ways. Don't take my word for it. Read it yourself. Both The Ravine and her book Hitler's Furies are available for sale after her lecture, and Dr. Lower will be happy to sign copies for you. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wendy Lower to DCC.
So much. You sure you don't want to stick around? Thank you so much. I think I'm going to check on the audio because I want to make sure everyone can hear me. I've got this working, right? And then if I walk around, can you still hear me? Is it still working? Not as well. Okay, I will remember to project if I move away from the podium. Thank you so much, Dr. Vanna Steger. It's just been a delight to spend a day and a half with you or so. And we were at the FDR library this morning doing research, so that was really enjoyable. And the Handel family, thank you so much for sponsoring this program and endowing his chair. You can't imagine how important it is to have these academic seats, these kind of centers across the United States. He mentioned the consortium. And this kind of network is super important for sustaining, maintaining, and growing the work that we do, which is primarily Holocaust studies, also studies in human rights and genocide studies education, in an academic setting. And I feel like this is important. In many ways, I grew up in the Holocaust Museum as a professional there before it even opened, actually. And a lot of the emphasis on Holocaust education is secondary education. And my particular view is that it's much more important with the youth, the young adults, because it's very difficult material, as you're going to see tonight. And I think that it requires a certain maturity, actually, to learn those lessons and actually apply them to your life. So these centers are super important in this infrastructure here. So thank you very much for all that you do, and thank you for coming tonight. So where are we going to begin? We're going to begin with a photograph. And we're actually going to kind of begin with the classroom, speaking of teaching, because my story kind of begins in a couple different places. First of all, I noticed when I was teaching the Holocaust, and I would put images up on the screen, graphic images, Einsatzgruppen, these are kind of motorized killing units, typical kinds of iconic images of the Holocaust. And I want to tell you that you are going to be seeing some disturbing images tonight. This is about atrocity photography, so just want to give you that fair warning. But I noticed that a lot of these iconic images in circulation, often put into books kind of last minute as illustrations, kind of being used in the classroom without any explanation, even in some of the great museums around the world, in DC, Yad Vashem in Israel, in Germany at the memorial. Few captions, and the images themselves were not the subject of research, right? Then as I started to learn more about the history, I started to realize how many communities were lost, where there was zero documentation, especially in a place like Ukraine. 1.4 million victims were Jewish victims killed in their hometowns primarily. About 250,000 were deported, so most of them killed in their communities. That's a whole other dimension of this past. But killed so quickly during a military operation that there was no documentation. 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust actually died in what is the terrain of Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion in 2014. So what do you do about those missing? Those who have there's not, any documentation, but you might find a single photograph. You might find any remnant of their past. And isn't it incumbent upon us to actually follow up on that if that's all you have and we're talking about massive numbers of loss of life? Okay, so up here on the screen, we have some images you probably recognize. The entrance to Birkenau. This one here is called, can you hear me? Okay, this one is called The Last Jew in Vinica. Very, very popularized item. Also at the major museums. This gentleman was shot in the the spring of 1942. This was commercialized. There were various anti-Zionist organizations that took this image and put it on coffee cups and T-shirts. So there's this problem of taking these images of atrocities, of victims, and then not only using them commercially, but in this kind of anti-Semitic way. Here, this is from the so-called Stroop album from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, right, which has another story because it's a perpetrator album of an operation. The Buchenwald liberation photos from Life magazine, Margaret Bork-White. Elie Wiesel is pictured here in the bunk. The liberation photos that show the corpses that Bergen-Belsen that are being exhumed and then reburied and given proper memorials, often involving local German populations as part of their re-education. This one here is an Einsatzgruppe, a motorized killing unit during the invasion of Ukraine, southern Ukraine, killing this Jewish family. Sometimes you see this image cropped, right? So often we don't see full images. It's cropped just to the single killer and the woman and the child to create a certain effect, right? These are atrocity images that are evidence of a crime, historical artifacts, right? But they also have a certain aesthetic value when they're reproduced. People make decisions when they put them in books or they put them in museums to look at and to wonder whether or not, since this is usually the dominant image, we lose this scenario here of the rest of that family, right? And of course, Anne Frank is an iconic face of the victim of the Holocaust. And there she is with her diary. And you know that story of her in hiding and her deportation to Auschwitz and ultimate death in Bergen-Belsen. So I started to realize that photographs are really important pieces of evidence of lost communities, that they required a methodology of research, and that we could discover new things about the Holocaust in these photographs. They contained clues, visual kinds of clues. And in 2009, I was working at the Holocaust Museum on a project. I was actually investigating a perpetrator who was still alive. And two journalists came to me and said, Wendy, we have this picture. We just got it out of the Prague archive. It's been locked in that archive during the course of the Soviet Union. Now with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we can get into these materials. It was a security service archive. And we have a little bit of information about it, and so maybe you can tell us more. It was taken October 13th, 1941. It was taken in a town called Mariupol, Ukraine, about 100 miles west of Kiev. It was taken by a Slovakian photographer. And they had a testimony from that Slovakian photographer that accompanied that image. He took 5 images that were actually developed. The camera that he brought with him could produce 8 images, but they only had 5 out of the 8. So this is part of a series, okay? And I'll show you some of the other ones later. But this was the image in the series that was the kind of centerpiece of his visual testimony, right? In the sequence that he took of that day. And on that day, we learned from his testimony that they showed me. It was written in Slovakian. I had to call on my colleagues at the Holocaust Museum, including a volunteer, a survivor from Bratislava, and I worked together with her for years, and she helped me get through this material. It's a lovely community of researchers in this field, I have to tell you. So this picture made its way to Washington, into my hands. I was working on something else, but I thought, I need to follow up on this. This is not a typical picture of the Holocaust. It's an action shot. It's a murder scene. The images I showed you before, 2 of them show actually the point of murder, but they're very rare in Holocaust photography. Most pictures you see are before and after, but not during the actual killing. As you can imagine, the Germans did not want those kinds of pictures to be taken or to be in circulation. And I started to look at it and think about the elements of the photo. Okay, the shoes on the bottom, that was me. That was me in the 21st century, because I don't think that our photographer was really looking at the shoes. But I was sitting in the Holocaust Museum, and below me was the exhibit of shoes from Auschwitz-Birkenau and shoes from Majdanek. And I was thinking about the shoes on the River Danube in Budapest that have been bronzed as a memorial. And it just struck me that there's something there. This was a prior victim. This is someone who wore those shoes, right? And then around the shoes, you can see papers. And when you zoom in, you can see bullet casings around the shoes. It's taken in broad daylight. And at that point, environmental history was starting to take off, and I started to take notice and do a little bit more reading on that. And I started to think about when these massacres occur in open air, Holocaust by bullets, broad daylight, the environment has something to do with it, and environmental history has something to do with it. And how did the Nazis put nature to work? How does nature become a kind of agent and a kind of a part of a system of killing? In places like Babi Yar, this ravine that after they brought the victims in and shot them, then they dynamited the walls. And then that was a way of covering it up, but also a way of suffocating, hiding, and the use of the forest as far as concealing these mass murders. To what extent does the terrain matter, not only in how these operations are carried out, but in the aftermath, because the victims remain there. That's someone's hometown, right? And then here we have the killers. And this is very unusual. And in fact, this was the first thing I followed up on, because as I mentioned to you, I was investigating a perpetrator. And I thought, well, maybe there's young men here. Maybe one of these people is still alive. Also, look at the Germans and the Ukrainians so closely kind of together in this unit, side by side. And it's happening, you can see the smoke. As I said, kind of an action shot. You can see the Ukrainian on the end who's in that position, shooting position. His face is kind of grimacing. You can see the smoke from the fire. You can see that there's a kind of halo effect from the smoke, which means that someone else had been killed before, which was explained to me by a ballistics expert, that this was a kind of execution site, and that here we have at least one prior victim, and from the size of the pit, we know that there were many, many more. On this day, it was a massacre of 96 women and children, and 49 of them were children. There's one of them. As I looked at this picture more and started to zoom in and out of it with the new technology, I started to notice that there was something on the woman's lap here that looked like it might be another victim. When the Germans implemented this Holocaust by bullets, they didn't waste bullets on the children. And so often was the case that there would be a child, and they'd always have the mother bring the child to prevent resistance, prevent commotion, to calm the child. And then the victims would fall into the pit, and for the children, the death occurred through suffocation and because they were crushed by the weight of the adults. We can see here on the uniforms, those are Red Army coats. That's just an auxiliary armband on those Ukrainians. So they are recruited on the spot. They're from the town. On the German uniforms, and then there's an onlooker there, a helper, the man with the cap. And then you can see those two Germans. And when you study their uniforms, you can start to figure out what unit they're in. How many buttons, what is the insignia on the cap, what are on the cuffs. And so it's this kind of investigation of the crime, as it were. This is a testimony of our photographer. I thought when he was taking this picture at such close range, and he tells us in his testimony, remember this is all I have to start with in 2009, he tells us what the make of his camera was, which was really important. He had a Zeiss Icon, and so I had to do a little research on that model camera and how many pictures could be taken and how close one would have to be to take a picture. And he was about 20 feet away from the scene. So I had assumed that he was a collaborator. If he's there that close taking a picture, and the Slovakians are part of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, which was the summer of 1941. They're part of these Axis forces, collaborating forces that all went in. And the Slovakians were part of the auxiliary kind of security police forces. And indeed, there was a Slovakian unit based in this town, of which Lubomir Skrovina, that's the name of the photographer, was a member. He was the company's scribe. And on that morning, October 13th, 1941, they heard the sounds of screams and commotion in the center of town. It turns out that the Jews had been gathered the night before into the marketplace before they were marched to the edge of town into the forest to that killing site. And the Slovakians, they overheard this, and his commander said, "Go check it out." And he was a hobby photographer, and so he grabbed his camera. And so he was there officially with two of his comrades. And they stood there, and he took those photos, unobstructed, because we have a nice clear picture. It's not clandestine. For the victims, of course, they thought he was another collaborator and were humiliated by the fact that someone was there with a camera while they were experiencing their last moments of life of further humiliation. But actually, he was in the resistance, and that was probably one of the big surprises, is that I discovered that this wasn't such a bad guy after all. He was someone I think a lot of my students could relate to. He was like 22 years old, and he was drafted and sent to the Eastern Front. He was not political. He didn't like the fascists. He wanted to just take pictures, and he used to have dance parties with his wife and skate around their apartment in Banska Bystrica, which ended up being in Slovakia the heart of Slovakian resistance. And he went kind of begrudgingly into this campaign. He came to this site. He had already experienced and witnessed mass shootings on the march towards Mariupol during the German advance towards Kiev and towards Moscow. He was writing letters to his wife saying that his hair was turning gray and that he couldn't sleep, and he couldn't believe that this was the war that was happening. And they were secretly sending film canisters through through food packages and tobacco packages so that he could get the film to take these pictures. And after he took that picture that I showed you and a series of other ones, he pretended to be ill. He didn't want to advance with the troops and was sent back to Banska Bystrica, and then pretended to be crazy and checked himself into an asylum where he could continue his resistance work with his wife. It's quite remarkable. He got out, and he went back to his apartment, and he started to tell the Jewish community, do not go when they call you for these deportations. Look at this picture. This is what's going to happen to you. And he sheltered a Jewish family in his home, including an OBGYN who brought his son, Lubomir Jr., into the world in 1943, and provided the resistance with radio equipment and all kinds of technical support at the end in 1944, and is a pretty amazing figure. And so this is one of his first testimonies. He says, the prosecutor says, tell us what happened on this day in that photo. Because during the war, he was harassed by the Gestapo for taking dangerous photos. And then after the war, the Soviet KGB went after him because he was in the Slovakian forces. He was an armed soldier, so he was considered a fascist collaborator. But he's a smart guy, and he ended up surviving both Gestapo interrogations and KGB interrogations. He said, one Sunday morning, probably in October 1941, I was woken up by soldiers from the company saying that German soldiers were detaining citizens of Jewish faith and that they could hear shootings close to the town of Mariupol. Then later we learned that the Germans were shooting civilians. I was sent with two other Slovak soldiers from our company commander to find out what was happening, and I took my camera with me. We went to the hill in the forest at the edge of town near the citadel where the civilians were being held. And then what I saw, the Germans were bringing those people in groups toward a clearing in the woods. There was dug a pit there, which corpses of the murdered citizens were already lay. When they brought around 10 people to the pit, they ordered them to undress, which in the picture I showed you, they have clothes on, and then they shot them in the back of the head, and I took pictures. All the photos which I submitted to you, I made in my dark room at home, or of my comrades in arms and of massacres of Jewish civilians. This is another picture from the series. You get a better angle of the Germans, and then you can see their uniforms. And then this woman here, I'm not sure what she's got in her arm, if that is a baby or an armband. Various people have suggested different possibilities there, but we can recognize the profiles, the faces of the Ukrainians. And now there's a third German in the picture. And here's Lubomir with his camera. This is after the war, and then his actual camera. He died in 2005, and he donated his camera to the Bratislava Museum of the History of Jews, asking them specifically to display his photos and his camera so that there could be better education about the history of collaboration in Ukraine. And here he is. In Mirapol, there was a photo studio that had been owned by a Jewish businessman family. And so this is kind of interesting that this is in September 41. He's in the center, our photographer, and they just were kind of fooling around in this photo studio and took pictures. And then a month later, he took those atrocity pictures that I just showed you. So the Holocaust was one of the most documented, probably it is the most documented genocide on record, both in writing, but also visually. I mean, millions and millions of photographs. By 1939, 10% of Germans, ordinary Germans, owned cameras. This is when the Zeiss Icon, the Agfa Film Company, I mean, Kodak, here, taking off. And so the portable camera was in massive circulation. And the Nazis were saying, kind of ironically, here's a photograph, an advertisement from a military magazine directed at ordinary German soldiers saying, this camera is an optical panzer, like it so will resist the warfare. And you can see the pictures of the planes and everything, and then you have the postcard. This is like showing, that this is a army soldier corresponding back home with family members, taking pictures to show this triumphant moment in German history, and doing this, with pride, and also in the context of the Holocaust with impunity, taking pictures of their sense of victory, their so-called euphoria of victory, also means their defeat of what they would say the Jewish Bolsheviks of the Soviet Union. And that these photos are supposed to be a bridge in this advertisement, Agfa, which is kind of like Kodak, a bridge between the home front and the battlefield, right? So I just want to point out that, and I know this from many other cases, these photographs were in circulation in people's homes in Germany. And it's a continental war, and those Germans are going back and forth. It's not like our experience of going overseas and having to stay in Germany for years after 44, 43. But, they're sharing this information. These things are being developed in public photo studios in Germany, and so the photo developers are kind of looking at them. So it's another example of how the kind of comment of we didn't know what was going on in the East should be questioned. Where is Mirapol? It is right here in the center, right? This is a 17th century map of the Jewish population in what was the Pale of Settlement. In Russian history, if you know your Russian history, the greatest concentration of Jews in the Tsar's empire was in what they called the Pale of Settlement, which is a reservation that the Tsars had set up, and it was in Ukraine, right? So when the Nazis rolled in, invaded the Soviet Union as part of their quest for Lebensraum, right, and their expansion of their empire, and Hitler in 1941 had said specifically to his Croatian ally, when we go into the Soviet Union and we try to defeat Judeo-Bolshevism, he said specifically there should be not one family, not even one Jewish family left on the map of Eastern Europe, what Timothy Snyder calls the Bloodlands. And this is what we refer to as root and branch genocide, whereby you see, because he said, Hitler, well, during the expulsions and other periods of pogroms, the children always rose up, or family members always came back, and they always came back. And he had this idea that this was going to be, as he said, a final solution once and for all. So the Germans are coming into these locations that are high population densities of Jews, the former Städtler. And so you have 30, 50% of Jews in the cities, in the market towns. They had been going there since the Poles had invited them in this manorial kind of system. And that's why most of them were not deported to the gassing centers, which at this point hadn't been constructed, because this is 1941, but that these military operations combined, regular kind of advance with the Luftwaffe and so forth, and then immediately on the heels of that, and sometimes simultaneously, these motorized groups coming in. But this is what the Jewish civilization, Jewish life was like, going back to the 17th century. And Mirapol was the center of that. There's a very famous play that is based on this town, that an ethnographer discovered at the turn of the century called the Dybbuk, and it's the story of this town of Mirapol. So it just is important to remember, what's lost. Obviously, the loss of life, but the loss of a civilization, of a culture. Here's Mirapol in 2014, that same marketplace that was so vibrant and where there was really, for quite a long time, peaceful coexistence. Of course, there was periods of pogroms, Khmelnytsky in the 17th century, but for many, 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 many years, a growing, advancing community. And I put this up here because this is the kind of vacuum, the kind of loss of a civilization, a culture, an economy. This is an old Soviet champagne bottle here. This is a monument to the Second World War. No mention of the loss of the Jewish population here. And this kind of emptiness there. This is where the Jews were gathered before they were marched to that killing site. And they had to walk from that, this was the center of town, walk down this road. Now in this direction, the champagne bottle's over here, and that monument. And then past that into the forest, this is past this building, which was used as a police station. You can still see the bars on the windows there. And those Jewish women and children, on this particular massacre, there were several massacres in Mirapol. They were left, kept here, and then they were brought in smaller groups. And some of the testimony I read described the German and Ukrainian soldiers and killers circling this building and bringing the women out, sexually assaulting them. Sometimes they would run into the forest, they'd grab them, and they were singing also the Todeslied, dun, dun, dun. So it's this kind of violence and this and the mockery and the humiliation. This is the direction they went. So they came down here. That's where the center of town is, and they're walking down here past this church and down here to the Mirapol Park. And then in here, and this is the actual killing site. This is a document from the Russian investigation of those Ukrainian killers. All right? So the photograph is sitting in the Prague, locked up in Prague. My German killers end up in a really small town near Bremen. And the Ukrainian killers have been dispersed. One is still in town, but after the war, many of those former policemen didn't want to stick around and be found out because Stalin's NKVD was tracking them down. And in 1986, actually it started in 1985, there was a prosecutor in the town of Zhytomyr, the nearest city, where there was an actual, like a county seat and judge and court. And he said, okay, it's 1985. It's been 40 years since the end of the war. We're going to do one more sweep. We're going to look for these former Ukrainian policemen and other killers. And he actually finds these 3 guys. But he doesn't have my photograph that you would be even looking at. And the Germans didn't have the photograph because it's sitting in Prague. They didn't have the most obvious evidence, right? But it's remarkable when you can see this is the Ukrainian, this is the likeness in his profile and everything. So this is one of those 3 who was actually arrested and made to reenact what happened, and that's why we have that sketch of the how the drawing of where the Jews were marched to and so forth, and the trees and all of that, and his fingerprints. The 3 Ukrainian killers who were prosecuted in 1986. 2 of them were executed in January '87. They were in firing squad. Interesting. And the third, he was a 15 years old. One of those killers was 15 years old, and so he was a youth at the time of the murder, and so he was sent into the Russian kind of Soviet prison system. Rubak, his name was, and he never came out. And so that was as late as '87. And my first kind of tour through here was 1992, and I just think if I had stopped in that town earlier, maybe I could have found out more. My first trip to Mirapol was 2014. The Germans, okay? So we get the Ukrainian killers. We have our Slovakian photographer who's still alive, and we find out he's in the resistance. What about the Germans? Right? This is 1979. And this is a small town outside of actually Hanover. It's January. This is what the policeman on duty that night, because it was an evening in January, an elderly man comes into the police station and says, I'd like to report a crime. And this is 1979. And he was one of those men in that unit, and he's going to denounce his former comrades decades later. And so I just think it's interesting that you have this standard kind of German police form, right? But it's the time of the crime is 1941. I'm sorry, this is being reported in 69. It says mass murder during the Nazi period. Who are the victims? Jewish and Russian people. We don't know who they are. Here's the gentleman who's denouncing his colleagues here. And then there's a brief description, and these are the two killers, the two German killers in the picture. Now, one of them had died by then, and the other one was questioned. And it was fascinating to read his testimony against the photograph, because he says, we didn't see anything, the killing was all done by the Ukrainians, and by the way, we were customs officials. I couldn't find them, because the uniforms that you saw up there were not like SS, like the kinds of uniforms you'd see from killers. These guys were supposed to be checking packages at the local train station, and so they were just stationed there, had no orders to kill anybody, is not part of their so-called job description. But on the Sunday night before that massacre, an SS man came into the casino, where the place where they're playing scotch, they're playing cards, and it's like a retreat home. And says to the Germans in the room, who happen to be stationed there, of all different agencies, why are there Jews in this town? And you better take care of this. And we don't have that much manpower. This is an SS officer. They were in the next town over. And then these guys stood up, these customs officials, and said, Jawohl, we'll take care of this tomorrow. So that killing group that you see is like an all-volunteer killing group. And the Germans with the Ukrainians don't speak the same language. The Ukrainians are calling out, I didn't mention this, the people who were killed, those were people they went to school with. One of the Ukrainians actually was angry at one of the women who was killed because she had slighted him. She was beautiful, and he went after her. So it was very much this kind of, a rural, intimate, kind of provincial environment, how this was carried out in this wartime setting. What about the Jewish victims? So when I started the book, coming from the world of Yad Vashem and the Holocaust Museum and Yam HaShoah, kinds of memorial activities, I thought, well, I should be able to find these victims. We have so many databases and so many names. I'm sure I can find these victims. Well, I don't think I did, actually. And it just made the story of the missing all that more profound for me. The list of victims we have of 960 Jews were killed in that small town. And we have about 450 names. And some of them are duplicates, and they're not, the material is really kind of scattered, as I said. This is the first attempt to list the names of victims when the Red Army came back in, and this so-called extraordinary commission, these kind of investigative units, started to quickly say, try to identify who was killed in the town. And you can see from these lists from Yad Vashem that there are clusters that are family units. Again, back to this importance of the family in the history on the part of the perpetrators and how they perpetrate it, and the finality that they're seeking as far as root and branch, and also the experience of the family in genocide. The absolute worst experience, it's everyone's nightmare, right? That you would be in the situation with their family and be murdered with your family or have to make decisions in that context. And so here we see family clusters and we see birth dates, and I thought that boy, the toddler, maybe he walked, so he must be of a certain age and maybe born between 1935 and 1939, and started to figure out if I could find a boy of that age, because it's hard to see the age of the woman who's kind of shielded. And ultimately, I zeroed in on a testimony from a woman who had made a kind of pilgrimage to Israel and testified that her cousins and her aunt had been massacred in the Mirapole Park in October 41. And then she attached this photo, and it's just such a beautiful photo. And I can't say for certain that it's the same, but I just felt like it was important to focus on this family in the book to at least document this family's history, if perhaps there was a likeness. I thought that the woman on the right end there, Hiva, might be the woman, that was bending over, and then this other child here might be the one that was on her lap, and then Boris, the little boy, kind of looked about the same age. These are her sisters and her sisters-in-law. I don't know why there's an emptiness here in the center, if that's deliberate or if somebody's been airbrushed out, but this is what is left of this community. These are the women and children. The men had been killed first to prevent resistance, and they're taking this picture in that studio where Lubomir Shkrovina was, and this is late summer 41, and they went in there and they wanted us to see this. They wanted to be photographed this way, not the photo I showed you in the beginning of the presentation. And we brought that photograph with an organization I work with, Yahad and Unum, Father Desbois and others, and we started to ask the local Ukrainians and showing them the picture to identify more and tell us more about these victims. And we also showed many of the local Ukrainians, now elderly, the atrocity pictures. This man was watching over flocks in the field and heard the bullets and went and took a look and climbed up a tree. And he started to identify some of the German units that had come in there, for instance. We could get bits and pieces from the Ukrainians. Because the Ukrainians, they're not reading Holocaust literature. Like, they can't confuse their memories with what they know from TV or from books. Their memories are very specific. They say, I saw a German in a green uniform on a bicycle. And then you say, oh, okay, then that's that unit. Or I remember they came in because it was my mother's birthday. So they might have like a shard of a memory, but it helps you piece the story together. And then we went to the actual crime scene to see if that could provide any more clues, and followed that path I showed you with a camera crew, and immediately realized that the terrain, as I mentioned earlier, the environmental history, is part of the story. We saw that the landscape had this kind of cratering effect, that the vegetation was disrupted, and that something had happened there. It was nothing kind of looked like it had grown, or that there were very small trees and very old trees and these mounds. And we started to kind of poke around, and in fact, I reached down and I found a piece of a vertebrae. And I couldn't believe that just beneath the leaves there would be human remains. And this is 2016. And that's because when the Soviets carried out their investigation in 1985-86, they needed to find victims in order to carry out the trial and in the pursuit of justice. And they used some pretty rough methods as far as excavation. And so they completely upended, overturned, and pulled up all these remains, and didn't, they're grave robbers trying to go in and see if they can find gold in these mass graves. And so this yet another violation, according to religious law, of these victims whose souls are now being disturbed, and that's also part of the story today. I'd like to wrap up with just a little bit from the end of the book about this event and about this photograph. When the first liberation photos of the Holocaust appeared in Life magazine and went into wide circulation, shocking images such as Lee Miller's close-ups of the corpses in the death trains at Dachau, they outstripped the human capacity for rendering experiences into words. These lapses between seeing, comprehension, and words are evident when viewing our photo. The empty shoes and the crumpled coat exist there as questions, as gaps in knowledge. They remind us of the victims whom we cannot see and the many who were murdered and remain missing. Prior to and during the Holocaust, empty shoes figured in abstract art, literature, and photography as symbols of humanity And the use of shoes to depict loss is not only a post-war curatorial technique of Holocaust museums, but there are historical sources of material culture. Shoes have come to aestheticize absence and mourning on a large scale. Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever, I don't know if that name rings a bell, he wrote a poem I found called A Load of Shoes. Actually, a colleague of mine helped me find it, Sarah Horowitz. And it was written upon the discovery of his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna ghetto in Lithuania. So he is working in the ghetto, going through the remains of people who have been deported. Abraham Sutzkever, his memoirs and his writings are brilliant. They've just been published. He was the only Jewish victim in the Nuremberg trials, was a Soviet witness to stand and tell this story. It's quite remarkable. Let me read a little bit from the poem that he wrote in January 1943. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride? Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps, look, there are my mother's, her Sabbath pair, and with the others. In Sutzkever's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance and patter. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers. Unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronzed as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. One photograph can pass across time and space from its creator to family members, prosecutors, curators, historians, and the viewing public. It can put things in motion and elicit from those who study the image or are questioned about it an avalanche of information and emotion. It tugs at our ethical sensibilities. At first, these images can shock and repel and seem impossible. But the afterlife of the photograph can become an ongoing story with twists and turns. Like testimony given in words, it can be subject to manipulation, such as cropping or airbrushing. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murdered missing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lower. And we have now some time for questions you might have. Just
Ukrainians have long been thought to be amongst the worst of the anti-Semites. Mm-hmm. And yet now, the president of Ukraine is a Jew. Mm-hmm. How do you account for this cultural shift in Ukrainian attitude? Mm.
Thank you for that question. After the war broke out in February 22, like with the ferocity and intensity that it did, and all of the attempts by Lavrov and Putin to, denazify Ukraine and completely suppress the history of the Holocaust in that way and invert it, and to vilify Ukraine, as the State Department said, by using anti-Semitism, right? I didn't talk about this book for a while. I was afraid that these images were going to play into that. And so I stopped, and then I actually ended up introducing a new course on my campus on the history of Ukraine. And many students took it, and some of them from Ukraine even, and they were very interested in my work. And then they went back, actually, during their breaks, went back during the war. And they started to do kind of on-the-ground research about anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and I was collecting things I could find here in the States. And it really opened my eyes, and I had experienced it as well. Some of the witnesses in Ukraine I spoke to, even in Mariupol, from that time, they still spoke about, were anti-Semitic, we could say. I mean, one woman just callous as far as saying, well, after the pogrom that night and after the Jews were killed, I went in and I ransacked the local store and I wanted toothpaste, or, kind of dismissive and not very sensitive to that history, but also forthcoming for me to collect the material I needed. There's a real generational difference today, post-Soviet Ukraine, and it's taken a long time to develop that historical understanding and that education by redoing their textbooks, by bringing in translating books. Just the cultural exchange has been tremendous, and that investment has actually been realized, because when we surveyed ordinary Ukrainians, this is not the case today. They're much more, adopting two things: the kind of Western language that we and consciousness that we have, as far as anti-Semitism is a bad thing. Jews are a part of your history. It's a rich history. There's a reckoning that needs to happen here. I mean, all the kinds of efforts that we've been pursuing, and it's working, right? Sometimes I wonder whether or not my Holocaust education here is working in the United States. And so it's not perfect. Now, Zelensky introduced legislation that criminalized anti-Semitic acts of vandalism and violence. They're very deliberate and proactive about that. And the Babi Yar Memorial Initiative, a new generation that looks westward, and appreciating the multicultural aspects of their history. So it's really important to distinguish between the reality of Ukraine on the ground and what Russian propaganda wants us to believe, and how anti-Semitism is being weaponized in this war. And there's a deep Russian history of that. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a czarist fabrication, right? So they know how to do this, and they like to do this as far as their anti-Western kind of, it's one of the wedge strategies they have. So yes, it's important. I appreciate your question very much. Thank you. Hi.
I don't know. Hi, Dr. Lower.
Yes.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I might ruffle a few feathers with this question. How do you reconcile the past of the Holocaust with what happened to the Jewish community to now with what's happening in Gaza?
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems, you were saying earlier, there was a shift as generations went by. Mm-hmm. At what point do you feel that the Jewish community within Israel kind of turned from the oppressed to the oppressor with all their support that they're getting, mm-hmm. not only just from here, but across the communities? And then I feel like there was a time, I'm 31, I do specifically remember when I was younger in school, the anti-Semitic jokes, people making fun. I remember seeing, cartoons, political cartoons of, disgusting pictures of Jewish people with large noses, and, so I would like to also know, at what point do you think that the Jewish community's standing within American society has elevated to a certain level where they are on now as an equal playing field with the rest of white America?
Okay, so that does move into various directions that I don't really feel qualified to answer, because they're about kind of things we're observing today. I'm an historian, so I don't like to draw conclusions until I actually have, closely studied something and trends and collected testimony and so forth. That's just my MO, so I can't really comment on that. It's hard to pin down. But I will make a couple of comments. First of all, as I was preparing this talk, in light of your question, I was thinking about, well, what are some of the atrocity photos, and Werner and I were talking about last night, that are out there? When do we can remember the galvanizing effect of a major photo that would shift policy and shift, the international scene and relations? We have photos from Vietnam, of the girl running, the napalm, right? Super famous, right? We have the little boy who washed up on the Bodrum beach in Turkey, and that changed German policy as far as immigration. They suddenly opened up their doors, and now maybe we're seeing the backlashes, right? But it was the right impulse. And so I wondered, well, what are the most recent photos now that can galvanize people? And I put that to all of you, because I couldn't really come up with any one photo. And I asked, Werner, what about from the Hamas attack, from the Nova, the hostages, and then the atrocities in Gaza, and the bombing and the bombardment of the hospitals and children, now these hostages returning. And, so there's plenty of imagery. There's so much of it, and it's so dispersed and scattered in social media. It used to be when our kind of witnessing was more collective, right? Through kind of just not as many outlets and not as many devices, that it had the power to change people and to open their eyes to something and then to act collectively, right? And so that's just something I was thinking about the last couple of days, that they become competing images instead of like galvanizing images. And yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that, but I thank you for your question.
Oh, okay.
Hello. You said there's so many photos and so many little pieces of history from so many different parts of everything that happened. How do you choose what to study and what to look into first? And how do you choose like the order you study everything?
Yes, we have 120,000 digitized photos at the USHMM and something like over 500 albums at Yad Vashem. So yes, there's plenty of material, and there's plenty of material right here around the corner. We were at the FDR library today, right? I think I go about it with my book projects as a kind of combination of things. It's the material that comes to you, that like this photograph came to me. Sometimes it's just serendipity, right? You're working on something else, and then something comes to you, and just stop and think about whether or not this is more important than that. Make sure you start your work with questions, right? That's one of my issues these days. I see a lot of people who are trying to prove points instead of asking questions, and asking questions means you're open to different answers or maybe no answers at all. It's kind of humbling. So questions, the material that comes to you, and being observant in the world. There's things that you're seeing, but you don't know quite, like, as I was mentioning, these lack of captions, these kind of things that are kind of bothering you and feel like are unresolved, and then maybe these things can come together in some way, right? So my next book project is about the last days of Himmler in 1945. Oh, why do we need to know about that? Who's Heinrich Himmler? My students say, who's Heinrich Himmler? Well, it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I've had collecting files on it, and read about it here and there. But in the world that we live in today, I see, like, because I work on Ukraine, I see someone like Putin and people who seem like they're almost unstoppable, and the infrastructure that we invested in, and many people died to invest in, as far as the Second World War, like the ICC, that doesn't seem to be working. So how do you bring down terror? How does it come down historically, with or without these agencies? So now I'm looking at Himmler in light of the fate of genocidaires since ancient times, to see if there's some way that maybe we did it better before. I don't know, or maybe they all got away with it. So thinking about some of the problems of today, not that everything has to be relevant, but just that because, you want to make the world a better place, right? Well, there was a question here in the front, too.
I think part of your answer may be in the control of the media. Because back in the 1950s and 40s, there was a composer who wrote Strange Fruit, whose last name was the name of the town where this occurred, Mirapole. My dad happened to have written the first arrangement of that piece as a ghostwriter for big band leaders. But that name is unique. We don't hear about many Maripols. And it was, I guess, in honor of that town and what happened there. But today we see the media being controlled by a handful of folks. And now we're seeing legislation reversed in the name of money-making. So it's an odd, ironic movement when folk music was able to galvanize people towards the civil rights generation of the 60s, 70s, I guess, to today where music has less of a role, but it's really just the media and who can control the media. So that's what was going on with Himmler, I suspect.
Thank you.
So, you've written multiple books about the Holocaust and about this segment in history, and I guess I'm just wondering, what set you on this mission to document this historical event?
Yeah, I don't have a personal family connection to this history. My background's German and Scandinavian, and I had an uncle who was a pilot and a grandfather who was in the RAF. But this is, and again, I think this is about also that history is all of us. You don't have to have a particular ethnic reason or kind of background to kind of take on a cause. And so, yeah, what can I say? I was in Vienna in 1985 as a study abroad student in pretty formative years, in my undergraduate years. And I just started to notice something to the point about just observing what's around you and questioning it. And I would go to Wernersbend, to these places. I would go to these pubs, these kind of Stammtische, where these men would sit around and drink beer and, and do this. And they were veterans of the Wehrmacht. They were Austrian in this case. And this was 1985, and Kurt Waldheim was running for the president of Austria. He'd been the UN Secretary General, and he was a Nazi in the Balkans. So this was all coming out, and I kept hearing these stories. I could understand the German, and they were talking. I thought they were talking about war stories, like you'd hear at the VFF or something, the local Veterans Association, VFW, sorry. And they were talking about these massacres. And I just was so confused. I was like your age. And I'd seen the movie The Holocaust on TV in 1976 when it was broadcast, and it was on NBC, and there weren't that many channels, and everybody was watching it. And it was the same year Roots came out. I was 13 years old, and I thought, wow, the history of slavery, Kunta Kinte, the Auschwitz-Birkenau. I mean, I just rocked my world. So just turned it upside down. And I just remember that. And I studied other things in school. I was a music person, and I was in Vienna because I was singing and everything. But it was like a past that wouldn't go away. And as I got into graduate school in history in Washington, D.C., and I had my German language, I could get that much closer to it. I could go right into the archives and look at these documents and write seminar papers. And they were so raw, the material. I felt it was so visceral. And then I would go to these places and see for myself. And then the museum started to open up, and I realized the educational impact of memorialization and the history of genocide and how important that is.
Do you find that there's an ongoing interest in the history of the Holocaust with young adults at this point? Can you hear me? Sorry.
Could you hear me?
Yes.
Should I repeat the question?
I think the question was, is there a continuing or ongoing history among new generations, younger, incoming students?
An interest in this history.
Yes. I've been surprised, and certainly after the Hamas attack, October 7th, my seminar last spring, 2024, was oversubscribed, and it was not just Jewish students. I mean, it was like people really wanted to understand this history, because with the war in Ukraine, it keeps being invoked, and they're like, I think I need to know about this. So people would say to me, I want to take your course. I've seen this. I feel like it's all over the place in the media, but I don't really know anything about it. So there has been an uptick, actually, as we've seen an increase with the war in Israel, the conflict in Gaza, and the war in Ukraine, the weaponization of anti-Semitism. So, I mean, sadly, the fact that this violence continues, it then kind of generates this interest. But I don't think it's anything we can rely on as far as a foregone conclusion that one generation after the next is going to be enrolling. I've seen enrollment dip, and I think it's really important to keep it in their curriculum. Again, at the college level, I think is super important when they can really read things like Primo Levi and really look at these documents and look at these photographs and not only understand the affect of them, but actually cognitively try to make use of them and make sense of them. And so that's why it's important, I think, to keep it as kind of like a fixture in the curriculum. Because once, this material is so compelling, and once they're in the classroom, I mean, that's it. I mean, no one says, I'm going to another class, and it just becomes this intense experience. And then it often will build to, oh, I want to go work in Poland at the museum in Warsaw, or is there an opportunity to go to Israel, or, and that kind of will develop into what they do in their adult years in some capacity, I hope.
We have time for one more question. Oh.
So with what's going on in Syria and what they're finding in the mass graves and so on, I guess my question is, with what you've been doing in unearthing information and fact and so on based on history, what kind of direction should people be looking at what they're finding to help make what you do easier to understand what's going on and what caused this and how it evolved into what the nightmares that we're seeing now?
Yeah, that's a great question. The organization that I went to Ukraine with, and I'm on their advisory group, Yahad and Unam, Together as One. It's a Hebrew Catholic organization. They did all this work in this former Soviet Union. They found thousands of graves that we didn't know exist. I think the number's now up to like 8,000. I mean, it's just massive. That all across Belarus, Romania, the Baltics. So they took their methods, which is testimony collection in those communities, with this priest, and this would be different in Syria. And they actually went and helped the Yazidi in the wake of that conflict in northern Iraq. The Yazidi, yeah. And they've kind of applied this to different contexts. They even went back to Ukraine in 2023 and collected testimony in the areas that were, reoccupied or whatever, reconquered by the Ukrainians, Kherson, and they went into Zaporizhia. Testimony collection is a certain technique, a certain method, but I think that it's very important for the victims as far as documenting what happened. It's important for the investigations to do it immediately, but with the right team of people as far as healing and the potential, I don't want therapeutic, but cathartic, just the affirmation, the acknowledgement of that happened. In a lot of these communities, especially in the cases of sexual violence, these are such taboo topics, and even talking about it, or in those cases where that kind of, or with Afghan women and so forth, where that they internalize that misogyny, so they don't even think it's a crime, right? So these are very, very complicated conversations, but I think that testimony collection is really important early on for educational, for evidence of the crimes, and potentially for healing for that victim.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lower, and please give Dr. Lower another round of applause. And the books are on sale outside, and as I said earlier, she would be happy to sign them.